God selected one particular people and spent several centuries hammering into their heads the sort of God he was, that there was only one of him, and that he cared about right conduct. Those people were the Jews, and the Old Testament gives an account of the hammering process. This is Pints with Jack, Season 5, Episode 36, Ecumenism Month, Jewish Lewis, After Hours with Dr. Yaakov Weinstein. Good morning, everyone. Pints with Jack is your weekly C.S. Lewis podcast where three friends, Andrew, David and Matt, break down and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis. This season, we've been talking about love, and we worked our way through Lewis's book, The Four Loves. But we're now in Ecumenism Month, speaking to people who love C.S. Lewis from a diverse range of religious backgrounds: Calvinism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Mormonism, and today we wrap things up with Judaism. And today I'm speaking with Dr. Yaakov Weinstein. Dr. Weinstein is a physicist for the MITRE Quantum Information Science Group and lives in East Brunswick, New Jersey, and he blogs at Torah from Narnia. Dr. Weinstein, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thanks so much, David. It's great to be here.
Now, I can't actually quite remember how I came across it, but I first discovered you on the Tradition podcast, where you were talking about C.S. Lewis, and as you were wrapping up that interview, you mentioned your blog, Torah from Narnia. And so I immediately typed it in and spent several hours reading your thoughts about Lewis and Narnia from a Jewish perspective. And I thought this would be a really great way to wrap up this series that we're doing at the moment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for finding me, David. I'm not quite sure how you did it either. I'm really impressed that you did. But I think it is especially appropriate as you were reading The Four Loves this season. And that's what the podcast and my article was about.
I was probably Googling something and somehow Google returned that interview to me.
Great. I'm glad you did.
Now, today I'm drinking a cup of tea made with a very posh tea bag, which my sister-in-law liberated from a hotel that she was staying at. And needless to say, I made the cup of tea myself because, as we know, he brews. The jokes will not get any better than this. If you hated that, you're not going to enjoy this podcast. Are you drinking anything?
So I am. So as you know, David, Thursday was the holiday of Purim, and we as Jews do share food and drink during that day. And so someone sent me this sparkling water with lime and watermelon flavor. We'll try it out. See how it goes.
Wonderful. I had never realized what Purim was until I got really into the Maccabees, and they did a song about Purim, and that was how I learned.
Whatever works is great, but the character of Esther is a very famous one in the United States. There's actually a whole book now on Esther in America. Very interesting.
Cool. Well, we are toasting a patron supporter today, Christopher Buchanan. And for our toast, I thought I'd use my favorite blessing from the Torah, which is found in the book of Numbers. Christopher, may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. L'chaim.
L'chaim.
And that's a nod to one of my wife's favorite movies, Fiddler on the Roof. Had to be done. So, Yaakov, can you just please introduce yourself? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much, David. So my name is Yaakov Weinstein, as David mentioned. I am an Orthodox Jew, and so I perhaps represent a slightly different perspective, as you may have had more recently on this podcast. I'm married to my wife, Leora, for the past 22 years. We have 5 children, ages 11 to 21. And as you said, I work as a physicist for the MITRE Corporation, which is a government contractor.
And for those who are unfamiliar with modern-day Judaism, I mentioned to you before the show, I don't think I ever met anybody who practiced the Jewish faith until I moved to the United States. I would occasionally see an Orthodox Jew in London, but that was about it. So would you mind just sketching for us a little bit of what modern-day Judaism looks like and some of the main groups? As with Christianity, you can go to infinitesimal detail. We don't need that, but just in broad strokes, what does Judaism look like today?
Sure, and please do remember that this is one person's view of of Judaism. If you put 2 Jews in a room, as the old adage goes, you will get at least 3 opinions. So this is my perspective, and should not be necessarily aligned with anybody else. But as you mentioned, David, there are currently where we'd say 3 streams of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. And the generation of that really goes back to the Enlightenment. If we talk about European history, then the Jews for a long time in Europe were in the ghettos. They were not part of regular civilization. And with the coming of the Enlightenment, the non-Jewish world around started looking and saying, well, Jews are people too, and therefore they should also have a place in society. And that raised this very intense debate and question for Jews. They had been in the ghetto for so long that there was a lot to be said. Well, maybe we should just stay here. If we go into the greater society, maybe we'll assimilate. And that's really where a lot of this comes from. So Reform Judaism at that time made a conscious decision to try to assimilate more fully. They, for example, removed from the liturgy any hope of returning to Jerusalem, any mention of sacrifices in the temple, and various other reforms, and hence their name. Some of that has been walked back, nonetheless, in the sense of commandments, mitzvot. They are not regarded then as binding. And again, there's going to be a range within Reform Judaism, but so I'm only speaking generalities. The opposite end then was Orthodox, and that is a name that was foisted upon us from without. Orthodox Jews such as myself don't consider ourselves Orthodox per se. We're just trying to keep tradition. Though obviously lots has changed, such as clothing and various things like that. And so that was the idea that no, Jews can survive in a traditional way, even in the modern world, even while interacting with the non-Jewish world around us. And of course, there's going to be different perspectives on that. Do we fully integrate? Do we integrate partially? Do we try to actually really keep ourselves in the ghetto and integrate as little as possible? But the common denominator for Orthodox Jews are the desire to keep tradition, the commands of the Torah, the laws of the rabbis as outlined in the Talmud, and then further works beyond that, as much as we can, as much as our ancestors always have. Conservative Judaism is actually an American invention. The idea was really to conserve, again, as opposed to reform, which was more liberal, more changing. Conservative looked to conserve. They became more distinguished from what became Orthodoxy as Jews started coming in from Russia in the 1880s, and then from other parts of Eastern Europe, especially after the Holocaust, and conservative Judaism took on a more historical Jewish path. Perhaps, and again, there's a wide range within conservative Judaism, compromising on certain traditions. So, for example, in conservative synagogues, you'll find generally mixed seating as opposed to Orthodox Judaism, where you'll find separation between the genders, and a number of things similar to that. Okay. So chances are then, in England, there is the Jewish presence in Europe is a lot more muted, I would say, than in America. In America, Jews tend to be loud, boisterous. I guess it depends how close you are to New York, but they're much more out in front. While in Europe, things are kept much more muted. For example, in Europe, even the most Orthodox of Jews, England is possibly an exception, but even the most Orthodox of Jews aren't necessarily going to wear anything that's publicly Jewish when they are out on the street. In the United States, I've gone with my yarmulke or a kippah, if you want to go for Yiddish or Jewish, and in every state I've ever been to, including states where there are no Jews, and at the end of the day, no one really seems to care too much. That would definitely not happen in Europe.
I visited an Orthodox deacon in San Francisco, and we got together and had a drink, and he said that whenever he walks around San Francisco, he says, "I wear my cassock. I'm not the weirdest thing here."
Well, San Francisco has its characters for sure. But even even if we're talking about in the Midwest or even in the Bible Belt in the South, certainly if you see anybody who's outwardly Jewish, chances are they're Orthodox.
And that's what you are. And what are some distinctives in terms of what does worship look like? What is, as we would say, what does going to church look like for you?
So Orthodox Jews pray 3 times a day, and that comes the source of that is from the book of Daniel. So it's morning, afternoon, evening. In general, we try as much as possible to have prayers in a quorum. which is 10 adult Jewish males, and thus in a synagogue, though one can pray at home as well, and is required to do so if not able to attend a synagogue. So the prayer service itself, the synagogue is, as I mentioned before, separate genders with a wall, not necessarily a full wall, but at least it's a barrier in between. The prayer service is, of course, all in Hebrew. Saturdays, which we call Shabbat, that is a longer service and includes also reading the Torah. And depending on where you go, sometimes the rabbi will speak or not speak. And then, of course, the various holidays, such as Purim, which we just had last week, and Passover, which will be, actually, this podcast is going to come out on Passover. And so there are then other things, other traditions, other liturgy that take place in the synagogue and at home as well.
Okay, I think that's given us a really good base because a lot of our listeners are Christian, and honestly, a Christian's understanding of Judaism really stops at about the first century. Which are you, a Pharisee, a Sadducee? We might know if you're an Essene. So it's really good to sort of just bring context up to date a little bit, and so people understand where you're going to be coming from as you engage the stuff that Lewis wrote. Speaking of which, let's talk about Lewis.
Sure.
How did you first encounter him, and what was it that you liked about him?
So I think as you, David, and as I think most of your guests, I first encountered Lewis through the Chronicles of Narnia. And of course, the Chronicles of Narnia remain my favorite work of Lewis. And that happened when I was probably 8, maybe 9. And even at that age, I knew, of course, that it was a Christian work based on the presence, of course, of Father Christmas and the celebration of Christmas and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But that never bothered me because, we live in a not totally Jewish society, so all Jews know about Christmas. Even as kids, we were told by our parents, Santa Claus is not real. Parents are really ones who put the presents under the tree. Just don't tell your non-Jewish friends that because you don't want to disappoint them. And so, so already at a young age, I knew there was at least written by a Christian author, and even I would say even. I don't know if it was before I was 10 or not too long after I was 10, I realized that the sacrifice of Aslan was parallel to Jesus and that there was something else going on in the book because we learn about Christianity because it is the majority culture in the United States. And again, not in any sort of bad way. This is just how things are. But it never particularly bothered me because I liked the books. As time went on and I probably, went through college and graduate school, and I had not read C.S. Lewis in a while. And I started reading the Chronicles of Narnia again at some point, probably in my late teens or early 20s. And I was like, wow, this is really Christian. Which I kind of knew, but I didn't really, feel it as much. I'm like, this is really Christian, but you know what? There's some really interesting messages here, things that can inspire me to be a better human, a better person, a better religious person, and help me in my relationship with God. And so from there, I started branching out a little bit, first to the Screwtape Letters. Then I think it was actually my wife who bought me the Four Loves, and then more recently, some additional works as well. And
you have a blog, Torah from Narnia. What made you get serious and actually start writing down your thoughts about this?
So as I mentioned, I do find a lot of the themes that Lewis brings up and his characters as well in certain cases are inspiring for me as a religious Jew. And I felt it was appropriate to share that with some of my fellow co-religionists. And so periodically I will speak, not necessarily in a sermon, but either speak or give classes at my synagogue. And one day I gave a talk about always winter and never Christmas. And the idea of that was the importance of the rhythm of the yearly cycle and how what happened in Narnia was the pause of that rhythm. And thus it became such a desolate and hopeless type of place, and how that rhythm is necessary for all of us as humans, especially as religious humans, as we go through the yearly cycle of holidays. So after I gave that talk, a friend of mine came over to me and said, Yaakov, I don't think I've ever heard the word Christmas used that many times in a synagogue in that short amount of time. And I thought about it and I was like, yeah, you're probably correct.
Mm.
So, and so then I started like saying, maybe there are other people out there who are interested in this. Or are there other Jews out there who are interested in this? I have actually no idea. And so I started saying, I'm going to start a blog. And my kids were like laughing at me, like, yeah, you're going to start a blog. You're going to start a blog. And then, I said, no, I'm going to start a blog. Torah from Narnia. Everybody's going to love it. And then like during Corona, I was like, all right, I'm really going to do this. And so, I used my minimal computer skills and said, let's see what I can do. And hence it started. And I was probably correct. There aren't too many people interested in it, but it's good for myself. I like writing. I like being able to sharpen ideas and like.
Well, when I heard that first interview, I was wondering, I wonder what makes somebody do this, because as a Christian, I have read a number of books by Jewish authors, modern day rabbis, and that to me sort of makes sense because Christianity looks to some of the same scriptures. The Christian liturgical tradition grew out of the liturgies of the synagogue and the home. So that I can understand. But what makes somebody look to Christianity when they're not a Christian? And I like what you said, that there's truths there. And in the book that we read this season, The Four Loves, Lewis has that line, whatever isn't eternal is eternally out of date.
Correct. And, I think if I could use like a parallel, if we go back to Genesis and the story of Jacob's dream, Jacob goes to sleep on his way out of the land of Canaan, as he's traveling north to escape from his brother, and he lies down in a holy place, and he has a dream of angels going up and down the ladder. And that's certainly an inspirational story, but our sages in the Talmud aren't satisfied with the story itself. They ask, well, what angels were they that were going up and down the ladder? Was it like random angels? Was it specific angels? And so there are a number of suggestions that are given. But one of the suggestions is that each of those angels are representative of a nation. And the nations, as they build up societies, they start climbing the ladder and they get closer to God, right? Because God is the one who's standing on the ladder in Jacob's dream. And that tells us something important, which is that any society that's constructive and that lasts has some wisdom to it, right? It has to, or else it wouldn't get closer to God. And so as an eternal religion, any eternal religion would want to know the sum total of all human intelligence, or of all human knowledge. What does all of humanity learn about God? And so it's important then, from my perspective, that there be somebody, I'd like there to be some Jew who knows about Confucius, and some Jew who knows about the wisdom of India. And there's some Jew and I don't need to know that because I can't know the sum total of human wisdom, but somebody as a whole, right? If you want to be a universal and eternal people, somebody has to know it. I guess my lot was cast to be Lewis, or maybe there are other people who do it too. But I guess that's just kind of how it turned out.
It's kind of a parallel to what the early church fathers spoke about. They spoke about despoiling the Egyptians. So whereas the children of Israel despoiled the Egyptians before they left, the Christian leaders of the early church, they saw themselves doing the same thing with pagan culture and pagan philosophy, scouring through it and finding what truth they could and putting it to the service of the faith.
Absolutely. And I think, I think this is something that unfortunately Christians get a bad rap for. I mean, I think every year there are articles in that we see about, Christmas comes from Saturnian or whatever other pagan holiday it was. And I have to say, obviously I'm not Christian, but I read these, I'm like, I don't know why that makes it bad. I mean, in fact, I think taking something and raising it and making it spiritual and holy, that seems like what we should be trying to do.
Mm. Yeah. That coupled with terrible scholarship makes those articles incredibly irritating. But are there many other people in Judaism who read Lewis, or are you it? Are you the anomaly?
So I don't want to say I'm unique, but I'd probably say there are not too many. There's some, based on the number of people who read my blog, there's like probably zero. But I don't think there. I think I am. I think I am a bit of an anomaly. And Judaism itself has produced a huge amount of literature. One of the things that I heard from a friend who was extremely insightful. He showed me the opening cover of a Jewish book. And on each Jewish book, there's like a picture of a gate, like the type of ancient gate they would find in the city. And he said to me, Jews never stayed long enough in any one place to be able to build cities. So instead they built books. And so there's a huge Jewish literature. And so given all that, it's like hard to find time to like go outside of our own faith. But, some of us try to anyway.
Obviously, you've written a lot about Narnia. So I'm really just going to turn it over to you. What do you want to talk about with regards to the Chronicles of Narnia?
Well, I think I would imagine that a lot of your listeners are wondering the same thing, same type of questions that we've been discussing, which is why is it that someone who is not Christian is interested in the Chronicles of Narnia? So the way I like to formulate it is as follows. So you've spoken about on your podcast, David, Lewis's meditations in a tool shed and looking along the beam rather than looking at the beam. And of course, it's Lucy in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader who looks along the beam, right, and sees the cross and the albatross, which is of course Aslan. But I think that if we think about it, and Dr. Ward speaks about this in his book, what Lewis was trying to do for us in the Chronicles of Narnia was to set an environment in which we can look along his beam and find God through each one of these 7 demigods, right? Each one of the planets, and obviously he did a wonderful job, and the book is very popular. But from my perspective, I'm looking at the beam at a slightly different angle, right? So we can both be in the tool shed, David, you and I, and we can both be looking along the beam, and we'll see in general the same thing. But if we're slightly off and looking from a slightly different angle, then we'll have a slightly different perspective and we'll see somewhat different things. So when I look along the beam of Narnia, so of course I see Aslan's sacrifice as representative of Jesus and some of the other obviously Christian ideas that come up. And sometimes I'll miss them. I remember reading Planet Narnia for the first time, and we discussed. He was discussing The Horse and His Boy, which you're going to read this season, if I remember correctly, because you're going in the right order, of course, of the books of the Chronicles of Narnia. And it talks about the moment in the book where Aslan reveals himself to Shasta, and he says, I am. It says, right, myself. I am myself. There, thank you. It says myself 3 times, and Ward writes in Planet Narnia like 3 times for the Trinity, and I'm like, oh, man, how stupid could I have been to miss that one? Like, any Christian would have obviously gotten down in a second. I like totally missed it.
Oh, you would be surprised.
Really stupid. But so sometimes I'll miss something because they don't, because I'm not a Christian, but hopefully, and one of the things I'm trying to do in my blog is because I have a slightly different perspective, perhaps I can add some color or some flavor, some embellishments on what would be a standard Christian view, knowing, of course, that C.S. Lewis himself was Christian and not necessarily thinking that he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia for an Orthodox Jew like myself to be inspired. So let me, if you don't mind, I'll give an example. I'll give a somewhat, what I think is first we'll start with what I think is a somewhat straightforward example, which is, and again, because this is coming out on Passover, in Judaism, if you're near a holiday or, whenever you talk, you have to talk about the closest holiday or the Torah reading of that week. Like, that's like the first thing you have to say. So we can do that here as well. Let me, I'm going to read, and this is in our notes. So maybe you see it there, David. I'll read a sentence that I copied here from the Seder. So the Seder is the ritual of Passover night, which involves eating, talking, singing, a bunch of other things to commemorate and relive the Exodus from Egypt. And so there's a line in the Haggadah, which is the book that contains all the instructions and the readings, which says, in every generation, they attempt to destroy us, meaning the enemies of the Jews attempt to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hands. And that, to me, is exactly what the eldest dwarf says to Rilian at the end of the Silver Chair. Right? He says, those northern witches always mean the same thing, but in every age, they have a different plan for getting it. So I don't know if C.S. Lewis was familiar with Haggadah and the rituals of the Passover night or not, but to me, that was like, okay, like this must be, it's the same idea. It's the same idea that evil comes up perhaps in different guises, but it's always there, and every generation is there. And, good people have to fight that in every generation.
In an experimenting criticism, Lewis says something to the effect of that each author, they shouldn't be a spectacle, but they should be a pair of spectacles through which you look into a different world, or look at the world in a new way. And I think that's exactly what you bring to this. And I would even be a little bold and suggest that some of these things could be in there purposefully, but subconsciously on Lewis's part. Because one of the big things he talks about, particularly when you pair it with, say, something like Planet Narnia and his essay, The Kappa Element in Romance, that what you consume, the environment that you create, is naturally going to affect everything. Therefore, somebody that is reading all of Scripture, including the Torah, it's actually not entirely surprising that if things come out of us that we weren't consciously thinking of.
I think that's correct, and maybe it takes someone to kind of nudge you a little bit in the arm and say, "Hey, did you mean this?" And the answer is, well, yeah. Now thinking about it, I did. Let me throw another one at you, David. I think you'll like this one. Obviously, you've been familiar with Narnia for a really long time, as have I. And one thing that I realized only a couple of years ago was the description of the fawn Tumnus when he's first introduced. Right, so he's walking along. He's carrying an umbrella and a bunch of parcels, and Lewis says, what with the parcels and the snow, looked just as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. Right? Now, if there's one thing that Tumnus was obviously not doing, it was Christmas shopping, because it was never Christmas. So what's the point? So why is Lewis suggesting that's what Tumnus is doing? And to me, this brings in mind another statement from our sages in the Talmud, who say that in the story, again back to Genesis, Abraham is visited by the three men who, at least from a Jewish tradition, we generally regard as angels, who are coming to inform him of the future birth of his son Isaac. And surprisingly, perhaps, he feeds the angels matzah, which is unleavened bread, and the bread that we eat on Passover. So our sages want to know, these are guests. You should give them full bread. Why are you giving them unleavened bread? And they say, well, it's obvious that Abraham must be celebrating Passover. And that's a bit of a question, because, of course, Passover didn't happen yet. So what is Abraham doing celebrating Passover if it didn't happen? But I think the answer is that there are certain events, redemption, the coming of a Messiah, right? God's fulfillment of the world, that are universal and that have to happen. And so it's true that Abraham didn't know the events of Passover, but he knew a redemption had to happen. It had to occur. And so he felt it. And on that day in which his future children would celebrate Passover, he knew that there was something, as it were, in the atmosphere that called for a commemoration of redemption. And to me, that's what Tumnus is doing. And Tumnus is really, despite his initial fault, is one of the most positive characters to me in the Chronicles of Narnia. And so, given his refined character, he would feel that redemption. And the day that Lucy walked through the wardrobe is the day that redemption began. And even though neither of them at that moment knew that redemption would happen and that Father Christmas would eventually come back.
So it's kind of like a prefigurement. He's acting out what has not actually yet happened, but will. Exactly. And to me, it was, I don't know how I would have answered the question besides saying, oh, well, it's foreshadowing. But that's not very satisfying. But, but knowing the Talmudic statement, I think allowed me to understand a little bit more about what C.S. Lewis was trying to get at. Or maybe he wasn't trying to get at, but I think it's still interesting. It's definitely a very Christian way of reading a text, because particularly the medievals, when they would look into the earlier parts of the Bible, they would see typology. They would see prefiguring of events that were to happen, because God is not only the author of Scripture, but the author of nature and history. And therefore, he writes his story not only with text on a page, but with events. And so that's why Christians look to earlier events and they see what was going to come with what we regard as the New Covenant. And related to that, I did wonder, because I think the first thing that everybody thinks about when they hear about your project is what do you do with the stone table? How do you understand that? Do you just simply, sort of regard that as, oh, that's the Christian bit of the story that we can't get around? But down this vein of thought, I was thinking that Christians look and see things like the sacrifice of Isaac, the Passover lamb, the temple sacrifices, as foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice. Can you put that sort of lens onto Aslan and the stone table and view the Old Testament events in that regard?
So I tried to go down that path, and I've not been able to formulate it to my satisfaction. And let me try let me try to explain why, at least from my perspective. The binding of Isaac and his aborted sacrifice, of course, plays a major role in Judaism in terms of theology, and also in terms of even liturgy when it comes to the high holidays. But one thing that comes out not on the high holidays, but more of the sadder days where we commemorate negative events in Jewish history, we always go back to Isaac, and the reason is because though Isaac was spared, his children sometimes were not. And what Abraham was doing, as you mentioned before, the way Judaism formulates it is that what our forefathers did is a sign for the children. And so, as it were, one could argue, Abraham had to go through the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, of course, at the end of the day, he couldn't, because there had to be progeny still from Abraham. But if he didn't, it wouldn't have allowed Abraham's children to sacrifice their own children when the time came.
This is one little bit of the Talmud that I had actually encountered, where some rabbis suggested that the value of the sacrifices in the temple actually came from Abraham's willingness to offer his own son.
Correct. And so, thematically, there's a lot to be said for all of that. What bothers me, and then our sages say, I should have mentioned this, exactly what you said, David, that place, Mount Moriah, where Abraham sacrificed or didn't sacrifice his son, that is the place that the temple was eventually built, right? That is the Temple Mount that we still know of today. And so I'm good with that, like with the stone table, except for the part that it breaks. And that's what's bothered me. Like, it shouldn't break, because like the story of Abraham and Isaac lives on forever. And I have to admit, like, even from a Christian perspective, I'm still not sure why it breaks, because Jesus' sacrifices for Christians also lives on forever. So why should the table break? I have to admit. So like, that's where I get stuck.
I think Christians would offer a few explanations as to why it would break. One would be perhaps that, as the Epistle to the Hebrews says, that Christ was sacrificed once for all, that whatever sacrifices that have been happening on this table, they needed to happen no more, because now the perfect offering was made in the person of Aslan. Therefore, that was the end of those sacrifices. I've also heard people interpret the magic and the deeper magic in terms of fulfillment of what came before. There are some varieties in that, but it is a very interesting question to pose. Why exactly does the table break? I suppose it's just because he wasn't in a tomb, so there wasn't a stone that could be rolled away to show that this all happened.
Yeah, I've been stuck on that one, but I do like the magic and the pre-magic, because we do have a similar parallel in Judaism as well. The Talmud tells us that there were a number of things that were created before creation, that existed before creation, and one of them was tshuva, which is repentance. That ability to repent and to fix what was broken is not in the natural world. It's something that's almost supernatural, and therefore had to be created before creation itself. And that's, of course, what happens exactly to Edmund, right? Edmund he is the repentant. He does repent. And even though, the White Witch saw a rebel and said, well, he's mine, because how can he go back from basically ratting out his siblings? And Aslan says, well, no, you don't know the deeper magic. You don't know what happened before creation. And before creation, repentance is alive.
And for anyone that has read the Torah, you find there's an awful lot of sibling rivalry that goes on there as well. If repentance wasn't possible, they'd be in deep trouble. You also had one example from the last battle. What was that?
This is something that well, also appropriate as you're going to be reading The Horse and His Boy. The whole question of colorman poetry is one that I struggled with for a while, because if you read colorman poetry, or the few snippets that we have throughout mainly The Horse and His Boy, they generally don't seem so horrible. So, for example, I'll use one example and then try to show actually how it is wrong. Ashish says, when the Tarkan comes into his home and eventually buys Shasta, he says, "Natural affection is stronger than soup, and offspring more precious than carbuncles." And that seems like, yeah, I mean, we do value our children a lot. They should be more precious than carbuncles. So on one hand, that doesn't actually seem so bad. On the other hand, he then turns around and sells Shasta, right? So obviously, maybe children are worth more than carbuncles, but they're not worth the 70 or 40 crescents that he's eventually going to get for Shasta. And it's not only Shasta's not the only child who's sold in The Horse and His Boy. Aravis is sold, right, to a suitor that she doesn't like. And so, yeah, maybe Aravis's father wouldn't have sold her for a bunch of carbuncles, but he clearly was happy to sell her for alliance with a strong Carloman household. And then, in fact, the Tisrak's own son, Rabadash, was sold. The Tisrak happily sent him to war in a desperate attempt to take over Archenland and Narnia, knowing that would likely sacrifice his life. And Tisrak says, "Well, if he fails, that's okay. I've got 17 other sons, so what difference does it make?" And so, yes, on the surface, the poet seems okay, but its application is wrong. And in fact, if you look in the Bible and you look at especially books like Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Psalms, which have similar statements to a lot of Carloman poetry, you'll see that the Bible generally gets it right, while the Carloman poets get it wrong. And so there's a bunch of stuff on my blog about that. But one thing that I haven't yet written about, because I've been kind of saving it for such an occasion, is there's one piece of poetry that we should take seriously, and that's in the last battle. And the person who says that piece of poetry is Emeth. So Emeth is a Hebrew word meaning truth, and Emeth is the character who eventually, though initially a servant of Tash, sees the truth and becomes a servant of Aslan. And so when he says something, we probably should pay attention, because he is the person of truth. And so when Emeth meets Peter the High King and the rest of the Narnian heroes in this afterlife of the last battle, so he says the following: "I know not whether you are my friend or my foe, but I should count it my honor to have you as either. Has not one of the poets said," here he quotes a Carloman poet, "a noble friend is the best gift, and a noble enemy the next best." Well, what's the difference between an enemy and a noble enemy, right? What makes an enemy noble? And so I think the answer is, and David, you touched on this in when you were speaking about friendship within the Four Loves. A noble enemy to me is one who is also searching for the truth. And while it is true that at the moment, those who are looking for the truth may be enemies because they may disagree with each other as to what truth is, it's a noble enemy because everyone is after the same goal, right? Everyone's trying to find truth. And so that differentiates a noble enemy from an enemy who may not be noble. And to me, that's what Emeth is, right? Emeth, though he was following a different religion, was also seeking to find truth. And because he eventually finds it. And so he could be a noble enemy. But the truth is that Peter replies to this, right? He's Peter the High King, Peter the Magnificent. And he says, "Sir, I do not know that there need to be any war between you and us," right? And I think it's interesting because Peter doesn't say, "Oh no, we're not enemies, we're pals," right? He says, maybe we are enemies, but that doesn't mean that there has to be a war, right? The war can, as it were, can be fought on different grounds. It doesn't have to be a battle. It could be a war of who is more kind, who brings more comfort to those who are sick, right? Who helps the struggling orphans, right? Those are wars that should be fought, as opposed to battles of violence. And the truth of a religion, while maybe a philosophical question, plays out on the ground. It plays out with its adherents. How much do its adherents adhere to the religion, adhere to that which is good and that which is truthful? So to me, like, I'm MF in a sense for C.S. Lewis, because I'm coming from that other perspective, and eventually we'll find out what happens. But
I do not think there needs to be war between us. Just saying.
correct, absolutely.
Well, let's move on from Narnia. I want to sample some other things that you've written about and spoken about. I wanted to touch on some things that I've seen in Torah from Narnia and on tradition online. Firstly, I heard that the Screwtape Letters was your second favorite Lewis book.
That's good.
Which we read last season. What are your thoughts there?
So the Screwtape Letters is just so well written. I mean, the perspective that Lewis takes, it's almost unique as far as I can tell. Definitely, as far as I know, it does not have a parallel in Judaism. And I think that Lewis uses it so well to speak to modern man. And what I especially liked was that there were a number of things that really spoke to me. So, for example, even in the first letter, Lewis already notes science and religion are friends. They are not enemies. We were just talking about enemies. What are enemies? Science and religion are friends because they both seek truth. Now, it's true that as two disciplines are going to seek truth, they may at times disagree, but that doesn't mean that they are at war. And Lewis says it explicitly, right? Lewis says, keep science away from your patient because it's going to allow him to wake up his reason and the search for truth, rather feed him on pseudoscience. And that's something that, as myself a scientist, I've experienced a number of times, which is people always come to me and say, you're a physicist. How can you, how do you make physics fit with the Bible? And I'm like, I don't know, but it really actually doesn't bother me very much, because if two modes of finding truth don't agree, well, probably something has to be studied more, right? Maybe the physics needs a little more. Maybe our Bible reading needs a little bit more. Maybe we're not understanding something, but that's okay. We'll figure it out eventually if we're really striving for the truth. So I really like that Lewis did that, like, right at the beginning. And then, David, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, actually just wrote a book called The Great Partnership, in which he discusses this as well. But that already grabbed me. And then he has this great line that said, that says there have been some sad cases amongst the modern physicists. And I'm like, that is a great line. And I can say, and for personal experience, whenever I'm not at conferences or anything like that, and I'm eating kosher food or whatever it is that I'm doing that's different, I've never had a scientist attack me for my religious beliefs. Never. I mean, I've discussed it with them. People are curious, and I'm totally cool with that. But never had anybody attack me for my beliefs. So I think that is very much more in the realm of pseudoscience than science itself. So that's definitely one thing that kind of grabbed me right at the beginning. But then there are other things that I really like about Lewis. For example, his idea of concentric circles and the idea of pushing from Screwtape's perspective, of course, pushing all that is good out and all that is bad, inwards. And I really liked what he says about the British, and so again, sorry, David, the British being particularly horrible about this, because they're the ones who get up and scream about how they're going to torture the Germans, and then he shows up and they're going to give him, serve him some tea and crumpets or whatever, whatever it is he's going to serve him. And I think that's really good, because I think we find the same thing in Judaism as well. There are times when we get up and we, well, either as part of liturgy or something well, let's just, we have to destroy our enemies and so on and so forth. But God forbid and some person ever show up, we would never do anything horrible to them. We never do anything bad to them. We'd welcome them. So I really like that idea as well.
Except perhaps a few instances in Judges. For example, if jail invites you over for tea, maybe pass.
Yeah, so Judges is a particularly troubling book, and speaks a lot to how things should not be rather than how things should be.
I went round to friends for brunch after two families were meeting for the first time. He and I have been friends for a little while, and he said that his kids are listening to the Bible on audio, and their favorite book is Judges. Of course.
As long as you don't get to the very end, that part becomes a little bit too risque for children.
Well, let's push on. You also wrote a 4-part series of articles on what Lewis considered to be his best book, Till We Have Faces, and we went through that back in season 3. What were some of the things that you touched on there? Because Well, this is a book. Let's just say that this is a book that so many people come to, and they have no idea what to make of it.
So I was definitely in that category. I have to admit, I had not read So We Have Faces until Reverend Mark Gottlieb, who was the one who interviewed me for the Tradition podcast, said, "Hey, Yaakov, you should really read So We Have Faces." And I'm like, oh, all right. So I read it once in like a day, and I was like, that doesn't make sense. So I read it again like the next day, and then I actually listened to the entire season that you did on So We Have Faces, and I was trying to like get a handle on what the point is. And so there are a couple of things I didn't like.
Only a couple?
A couple.
Most people usually have a small list. Apart from my co-host, Andrew. He has nothing on that list.
I appreciate like that C.S. Lewis is willing to build Christianity off of paganism. From my perspective as a Jew and what my religion is built off, I don't like that. I'm gonna Christians obviously have the right to decide, but how they view their own religion. But like for my religion, that doesn't sit very well with me. But the other thing that bothered me, and I touch on in the blog, is like, why was C.S. Lewis so interested in the story of Psyche and Cupid? Like, all right, I mean, it's another myth. I mean, the Greeks and Romans have plenty of them. Like, what is it that spoke to him? And I think the answer to that is the end, right? How do you make the gods beautiful? And that's what any religion, I think, tries to do. Any religion that's universal tries to do to humanity. Judaism is not a missionizing religion, but it's nevertheless a religion that wants to bring all of humanity close to the worship of the one God. And so that idea of making God beautiful is an eternal message for anyone who is of a religious bent. And so how do we formulate a story, given that, for whatever reason it was, that C.S. Lewis likes the story of Psyche and Cupid? Like, let's take that story. What do we expect then from a story that ends in making the gods beautiful? Obviously, the idea of making Venus beautiful is irrelevant, because that's not beauty in C.S. Lewis's eyes. What's beauty in his eyes is Christianity, right? So what we expect is that by the end of the book, the gods should be made beautiful, meaning that the society has taken on, at least if not full Christianity, something approaching Christianity. And then the book itself is how does that happen, that a pagan society can transform in that way? And I think what we see is a number of different people and how they react to the pagan gods around them, right? So there are those like Arual who hate the pagan gods, and that was one of the other things I didn't like. I don't like as much about So We Have Faces. Like, I think that C.S. Lewis is too hard on Arual. She has a lot of work, but I actually think he's too hard. I think he was too hard on her. I actually don't think she's that negative a character, especially we have at the end. I'll open it so I can read it. I can read it explicitly here. Right, that Arnhem says about Arual. This book was all written by the Queen Arual of Glome, who was the most wise, just, valiant, fortunate, and merciful of all the princes known in our parts of the world. Now, that description was true even before her last realization and her last willingness to accept the gods. So, and that should count for something in my mind. So I don't like, throwing Arual under the bus here, because like she was, Arnhem is correctly and accurately describing her. So you have people like Arual who see the gods, the pagan gods, and hate them because they want human sacrifice, and because they want blood, and because they want all the things that we see in the worship of Angit. And then you have other people like Bardia, and it's hard to find a more noble character than Bardia. In anywhere what C.S. Lewis wrote. We can talk about Reep, right? But like Bardia is a very positive character. And he basically says, well, I'm not going to go against what the gods say. I'm not going to do this and that or whatever it is that the gods don't want. But like at the end of the day, I want the gods, the gods will stay in there, and I'm here, and I don't want to do much. That's clearly not what we want, right? That's clearly not the Judeo-Christian values of having a personal God who you can turn to in times of trouble and in times when seeking comfort.
But I would say it's something that we all do very easily. The idea, well, I've attended temple. I went and received the Eucharist. I've been baptized. Okay, now we're good, so can you just stay over there and not invade my life? There's a section in Mere Christianity where Lewis says that we treat God like our taxes. We just kind of want to deal with him maybe once a year, give him a cut of what he's owed, and then we generally want him to stay away from us the rest of the time.
That is a fair point, and I agree with you. It does happen. It happens in Judaism too, just so Christians shouldn't feel that doesn't happen anywhere else. But we expect better from Bardia, right? I mean, Bardia is such a positive character. We would expect better from him. But then you have people like Psyche, who can see through all that negative worship and actually see that gods should be loved, right? And of course, the other person in C.S. Lewis's works who does that is Emeth, who we spoke about before, right? Emeth sees through Tash and can love, even though he doesn't know, he thinks it's Tash. It's not, right? He thinks it's Tash. But those to me are very parallel characters. And note that the chief, the high priest in Glome, wears a bird's head, right? And Tash is a bird. So I think there's something to be said for that. But so I think that's what happens. And the question is, Psyche goes and is taken by the god of the west wind. And what should have happened, right? If nothing else had occurred, if Arual had never gone to see her, or if Arual had gone and said, okay, great, I'm glad you're happy, I'm going home, what would have happened? Well, it doesn't look like anything would have happened. The West Wind and Psyche would have lived happily ever after. And that kind of would have been the end, I think. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they would have had a child, and that child would have been a Christ figure that would have brought Christianity, possibly. But it's not obvious that that's what would have happened. What makes gods beautiful, what leads to the gods becoming beautiful, is that Arual forces Psyche to rebel against the pagan gods. And she's not wrong, in my mind, because the pagan gods are hateful, right? And the pagan gods are, how could it be that the gods want a human as a lover? And so Psyche, and then there's another question, which I still haven't totally figured out, which is, why does Psyche actually listen to Arual? She says she hopes that her husband will forgive her and is likely to be more forgiving than Arual herself, which is certainly true. But still, if she really loves her husband more, she should have sacrificed Arual, right? That would have been the correct thing to do. But let's put that one on the side for the moment. So we know what happens, of course, and Psyche goes and has to fulfill her tasks. And the god of the west wind comes and says, Arual, you too are Psyche. And what does that mean? And to me, what it means is that as positive a character as Psyche is, as much as she loves the gods, she can't do it alone. She can't bring about the true religion on her own, because she can't relate to everybody else, right? Emeth, can see the truth, but he can't teach the truth to everybody. It's impossible. Psyche would have just been happy staying with her god, right? Staying with the god of the west wind. But the society is not ready yet. It's like Elijah. This is the parallel he makes. Like Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet loves God, right? And there was no one like him, but he was a failure in terms of convincing the northern kingdom of Israel and its citizens to worship the one God, right? There's this entire scene on Mount Carmel where he's able to bring down the fire to consume the sacrifices that he makes to the God, as opposed to the prophets of the Baal and the idols who are unable to. And the Jews say, yes, our God is God. God is the one. And then the next day, the evil Jezebel says, I want Elijah's head, and nobody seems to say, well, that's not a very bad idea. We're going to rebel against you, right? So Elijah fails. No one doubts that he loves God, right? But sometimes people who are so close to God can't bring it about, can't bring that feeling to the rest of humanity, because everyone else looks at them and says, well, yeah, you're up there. Who are we? And so in order to prepare Glome for the coming of Christianity, Glome itself has to be transformed. And that's what Arual does, in my mind, right? So she fixes, or she improves, 3 pillars of Glome society that, to me, are parallel to the tasks of Psyche herself, right? So she transforms the castle and the laws, right? So she gets rid of a bunch of slaves, right? And we know how the castle was in the time of King Trom. There are little bastard kids running around all over the place, right? There are slaves all over. And as long as King Trom gets what he wants, everyone else can do what they want, he doesn't care. And so Bata can be this horrible blackmailer and, and mafia kingpin, and nobody cares because King Trom is happy, so King Trom doesn't put a stop to it. But Arual solves all of that. She brings order, right, to the castle. And by bringing order to the castle, she then goes and clearly states the laws of Glome and has them chiseled, somewhere in the public square, so everybody can know. And that's so important, because how can a society be moral and just if the laws are not clear, right? Nobody would know how to, what is right, what is wrong, what they'll be punished for, what they won't be punished for. That's exactly what King Trom did. He didn't like someone, so he killed them, right? And so and that was it. There were no laws. She brings order and law, and that's kind of like Psyche having to separate all the seeds, right? Because the mixture of seeds speaks to disorder, and the separation of them speaks to order. And then Aruel goes and she expands on the agriculture. It expands on the economy of Glome, right? So Glome was an agricultural-based society, an agrarian society, but they have these silver mines that no one ever seems to care about, except as a way to kill people. Well, that's not very smart. And of course, Aruel realizes that and turns the mines into something productive, not only productive in terms of actually getting silver, which was very important, but also productive in terms of finding good people. Slaves who are able to be industrious can earn their freedom through the mines, right? So she transforms the entire economic state of Glome, right? She also widens she deepens the shenet, right? So she allows more trade. There are a number of things that she does in that sense. And that's very much, of course, like Psyche getting the golden fleece from the sheep, right? It's Arual who takes the punishment for it. She's the one who has to go through all the work, and Psyche can just take the gold. That, of course, and the gold representing the economy of Glome. And then finally, she actually transforms the House of Ungit itself, right? So it's worth. You mentioned before we started Jerusalem and Athens. Well, that's exactly what happens, right? Who is the fox's best student? It's Arnhem, the high priest. Right? He is the first one to read all the books that the fox buys. He is the one who starts speaking of the gods in a philosophical way, and that seems to be a positive, right? In the book, that seems to be Arnhem is actually the only one who calls the fox by his real name in the entire book. How did that happen? Like, how did that? It's probably because they were working together to do the best for Glome, right? And that's good because they were again both trying to find truth. So even though they may have been coming from different perspectives, they were able to work together in order to do that. But that was also necessary in order to prepare Glome for the coming of the true religion, right? For the coming of Christianity. And then, but the last step though has to be taken by Psyche, because if not, Arual did it all for herself, right? She did it to keep herself busy. She did it because she was just wanted to be the opposite of her father. And for whatever reasons she had, they weren't religious. They weren't done in order to make the gods beautiful, even though they served to help make the gods beautiful. But Psyche is the one who can then come back, and now Glome is prepared. They could listen to her, as it were, right? When she starts preaching the true religion. And so that's her job then, to go to the Deadlands, which perhaps is the philosophy of Greece, which does not allow for the true gods, but she can bring the beauty back from the Deadlands and actually spread Christianity, though that part's not in the book.
Wow. I wanted to interrupt so many times when I was like, oh, I like that. It's like, oh, I gotta disagree with that. I think all we've definitely proved is that you're definitely coming back on the show. I'm getting Andrew, and we're going to talk a lot of this out. You bring some really interesting ideas, some of which I like, some of which I don't like, and we will hash this out.
Absolutely.
Now, this season, we've been going through the Four Loves, and you were invited on the Tradition podcast to talk about your essay, which was called The Four Facets of the Love of God. And you do draw on Lewis's work. In a little bit of time that we've got left, what do you talk about there?
Sure. So I was taking a different perspective, and this was really one of the first things that struck me when I first said to myself, I can actually use this in my life. When I was maybe I shouldn't do this with Matt not on the show, but I found myself a number of years ago, more than a couple of decades ago, in a similar position to Matt. Many of my friends were already married, and I was like, I couldn't find anyone, and I was like, disappointed, and I was like, is this whole thing like really worth it? Do I have to like bother with it? It's such a pain in the neck. And I said to myself, well, you know what? If I want to be able to love God, I have to know what it's like to love someone else. And I remember like talking to my friends about this new philosophical perspective that I had come up with. And then I found it effectively, to my mind, in the Four Loves. Now, of course, Lewis doesn't formulate it that way, though I think he does a little bit more in some of his other works. But
well, he says that the highest doesn't stand without the lowest, which
correct,
means an
correct.
earthly eros can contribute to your understanding of higher loves.
Correct. That's what he says. But in the Four Loves, it's the idea of any natural love is not going to remain, right? The loves become a god, the loves become a demon, and therefore you need to bring God into them. And I said, well, these are interesting categories, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm a physicist, so I never heard of different categories of love before until I read the Four Loves. I'm like, you know what? These can be useful, because this probably gives a way of how do we love God, and we see these different perspectives in Jewish liturgy, and in fact in the Bible itself. So for example, in Hosea, which I think is how you pronounce it in English,
Hosea.
Hosea, and then we call it Song of Songs. I think Christians call it
Song
that
as well, or Song of Solomon.
Song of Songs, okay, right. So the model is the model between God and his people, or God and an individual, is that of man and wife. But in our prayers, it's certainly not like that, right? We refer to God as our Father, our King. And in many other ways too, we refer to God as our shepherd. We refer to God as the one who allows us to do anything. So how do you take all of these perspectives should inform us into the great commandment of loving God? How do we do that? Like, what does that mean? Can we love God as a lover? Can we love God as a father? Can we love God as an acquaintance or as a friend? And so, for example, for acquaintance, for affection, the first one, right? So I always think of you mentioned before the famous Jewish movie about Tevye the milkman,
Fiddler on the Roof.
Fiddler on the Roof. Thank you. Blanking on the name. So Fiddler on the Roof, and like, what is the relationship between Tevye and God, right? It doesn't really seem to be like a relation between lovers, for sure not. But like, Tevye's like, God, I can't believe this is happening too. And if Tevye ever like found out, not that this is true, but if he ever found out that God wasn't there, like, he'd be really disappointed. Does he love God as a friend? Does he love God as a lover? No, of course not. But God is the one who's always there for him. Right? He's the one that Tevye can always complain to. And so that means something. And that is who God is. God is the one that we as humans, any human, can always rely on. He is always there for us. Even if we don't, perhaps notice it, or if we kind of treat him as the trusty, the crusty gardener who Lewis talks about in his chapter on affection. So that's what I tried to write about in this article was that, can we approach God with all of these loves, and how, hopefully doing that, exactly how you said, David, we need the natural loves to inform us as to how the spiritual love, the love of God, should be, again, from our perspective. How should we love God? Not how God loves us. I'm not saying that's not important, but how do we fulfill the commandment of loving God? And so that was kind of like my thought process in that. And as you said, the use of Lewis's concept of transposition, that the highest the highest cannot stand without the lowest. How we need those natural loves to give us a glimpse, if not necessarily a full picture of how we should love God.
What I love about what you just said is it's kind of a vindication for what I said at the end of our study of the Four Loves, that I think Lewis is trying to give us a sketch here. You described it as giving us some categories. He's giving us some stuff to work with as we then ask the bigger questions and try and tease out the details. Because I don't think he gives us a completely tied up, systematic understanding of love from top to tail. He's not. He's giving us some sketches, giving us some things to think about, a set of vocabulary to describe the kinds of loves, and then we ourselves then have to do the hard work still of thinking about it further, and even worse than that, actually trying to practice some of this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think, the hardest part for me in that article was, can we love God as charity? Because, on the surface, that's that should be a no-brainer. Of course you can't. God gives us everything. How can we love him as charity? But Lewis actually says that God gives humans this amazing gift, this amazing ability to love God as gift love, which on the surface is just completely insane. How can you say that there should be gift love? How can a finite, human have gift love for an infinite God? But he does, and we see it actually with Abraham himself. That after his war with the four kings, so there's a statement there there's some of the pronouns are unclear, but the way some of our commentaries read it is that God considered Abraham's love for him as tzedakah, right, as righteousness or charity, and so Abraham had been preaching the love of God for his entire life, and he relied on God. He did God did everything for him. He knew that God was the center of his world. Nonetheless, right, God perceived Abraham's love for him as one of charity, and so I think God does give humans that amazing gift that we can we can love him in that way.
The thing that comes to mind there is in Mere Christianity, where Lewis talks about the son who comes to his father and said, "Give me tuppence so I can buy you a gift." The father isn't winning out of this exchange, really, but he actually also is, because he wants his son to love him. And to pull an example from the book of Samuel, when there's a famine in the land, David is told to go and offer sacrifice at this particular place, and he comes to the guy's farm and he says, "Take everything you want. You can have the land. You can have all of the oxen and everything else that you need for the sacrifice." And a line that always sticks with me is David replies that, "I will not offer the Lord a sacrifice which costs me nothing." David wants to give something of himself to God. And I think that's the very deepest thing, because how can you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength without wanting to give him your very self?
I think that's exactly right, and I think we see it also in the building of the tabernacle of the Jews in the desert. Right, God asks them to give presents to him, to build a tabernacle so that he can rest among them. Right, he doesn't need a tabernacle to rest amongst his people, obviously, but he wants his people to give. He wants them to be part of building a structure that he can, dwell in, knowing, of course, that an infinite God can never physically dwell in a finite structure.
Yaakov, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really fun.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great, and hopefully I've been able to give a slightly different perspective on some C.S. Lewis's works. Absolutely.
Now I hear the final call for drinks at the bar. So to wrap things up, can you tell people where they can go to find out more about you?
Sure. So anyone who's interested can go to my blog. It's torahfromnarnia.blogspot.com, and you can email me at the same address, torahfromnarnia@gmail.com. I'm always happy to hear from people. And there'll be links in the show notes. Thanks again to Yaakov for coming on the show, and thanks to all of you for listening, our Patreon supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters, Amanda, Emmy, Thomas, Deborah, Anonymous, Bill, Joanna, Snort, Bud, Shane, John, Kevin, Brian, Kay, Paul, Kimberly, Gillis, Gary, Stephen, Matt, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, and Rowdy. Please follow us on social media. Please write us reviews wherever you listen to this podcast. And please join us next time when we'll be going further up and further in. Cheers. Cheers.